There's nothing smart in the name, yet the notion of smart sanctions is something that the U.S. claims to be a successful use of non-confrontational force on any nation that shies away from the so-called American version of democracy. However, in times of international crises, such as the current global COVID-19 virus pandemic, the added burden of dealing with sanctions can be the difference between life and death, not for the nations or the governments of those nations, but for the everyday people that live in them.
ما مطمئنیم و مدارک و شواهد متقنی داریم که در طی یک سال گذشته دولت ایالات متحده مستقیم و غیر مستقیم، رسما و حتی غیر رسمی، علنی و پنهان، شرکت‌های مختلف و بانک‌های مختلف رو تحت فشار قرار داده که تبادلات مالی در حوزه دارو و تجهیزات پزشکی به سمت ایران حتی المقدور انجام نشه و ایران رو در حقیقت مردم ایران رو تحت فشار قرار بده. این رفتار یه رفتار غیر انسانی، خلاف موازین بین‌المللی.
Well, for a country like Syria, there's a further layer of conflict on top of this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and the sanctions imposed by the U.S., meaning that access to basic medical supplies, aid equipment, and everyday essentials quite simply means the sanctions are killing people.
الخوف على الأجهزة الطبية الموجودة عندنا، هي الأجهزة أغلبها مستورد، أغلبها موجود من برا، يعني احنا ما عندنا تصنيع أجهزة طبية بخصوص الأجهزة الإلكترونية هي. فللأسف نحن هلا الجهاز اللي عم بيخرج عن خدمة سواء للصيانة أو لعطل فني أو أي شيء للأسف ما عم بيطول كتير ليتصلح، عم نفقد كتير قطع بهي الأزمة، فلسه الخوف على هاي الأجهزة تحديدا لقدام كتير شديد.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Wai. In this week's episode of the show, we'll be taking a look at the cruel economic effect of sanctions imposed by the U.S. on the people of Syria, Iran, and beyond. As I always say, at this stage of the show, we want you to share your stories with us. Have you been served an injustice, or are you being denied an opportunity? Has your community suffered at the hands of others? Please get in touch with us via our Twitter feed by using the marker @ED_program, and let us share your story with the world. Well, a recent report by the independent UN human rights experts have noted that sanctions need to be lifted, or at the very least, eased, to allow nations across the world access to vital supplies to fight the coronavirus. The report stated that people in these countries cannot protect themselves against the disease, and hence why such large numbers are becoming infected, or worse still, dying. The report went on to state that people in Cuba, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen are struggling to access basic commodities such as water, soap, electricity, and food. The report simply states that such actions are a fundamental breach of basic human rights by the U.S. However, there is clearly no signs by the U.S. when it comes to easing its brutal use of economic sanctions on countries around the world. Just recently, it passed what's called the so-called Caesar Act, placed against Syria, claims on paper to be aimed at protecting civilians. However, the harsh reality is the Caesar Act and many others like it around the world are doing quite the opposite and, in fact, killing ordinary citizens.
The US currently has in excess of 7,000 sanctions placed on various nations around the world, which the US claim are designed to provide an alternative to conflict and act in the interests of American national security. In the case of Syria, the 17th of June 2020 saw the most intensive and diverse wave of sanctions ever applied by the US on the country. Named the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, or simply the Caesar Act, the bill allows the US to give further powers to the US government to sanction Syrian businesses, individuals, and the government of Syria, ranging from economic powers down to the ability for the Syrian army to act in defending itself. The Syrian government, however, brushed off the act, stating that Syria would never bow to US pressure.
إذا كانوا يحلمون بأن ترضخ سوريا وشعبها لشروطهم أقول دعهم يحلمون لن يحدث ذلك.
Whereas the sanctions were supposed to target the government of Syria, it seems that they merely make life harder for the citizens of the country, making life more expensive for the ordinary people, many of whom are now turning away from their own national currency, the Syrian pound, in favour of the more stable Turkish lira.
قانون قيصر ما بيأثر لا على النظام ولا أعمدته.
Like many nations living under sanctions, the immediate impact of them is felt at the value of the local currency, which for Syria has seen the value of the Syrian pound fall by almost 50% on the official exchange rate with the dollar, and inflation hitting around 25.5%, essentially making the lives of everyday traders, businesses and people ever more expensive, and having very little effect on the so-called targets of the sanctions. This raises the question then as to whether the true intentions of the US when imposing sanctions on Syria and beyond are not really designed to hinder a government, but in reality they're designed to squeeze the people into an economic chokehold and hence try to make them turn on their own government by proxy for the US.
One may think that the US has a handful of sanctions in place against a list of maybe 6 or 7 nations globally, but in reality, the US in the year 2019 alone had some 7,967 sanctions placed on people, companies, entities, and nations, raising the question as to just whom is keeping track. Let's take, for example, the case of Obama in terms of its transition to Trump. When current US President Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the list of total global US sanctions grew by 700 in a single day on that ill-fated November. Iran is now the largest state target for US sanctions. The US, however, has flipped the imposing of sanctions into a political tool, with the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ordering 12 rules that Iran needs to abide by in order for sanctions to be lifted, essentially making it nothing more than blackmail, with the notion of Iran renouncing nuclear weapons, which, incidentally, it never intended or intends to pursue, as well as ceasing support for groups like Hezbollah, all whilst the US supports multiple terrorist organizations against Iran and around the world.
Iran is one of the most sanctioned nations in the world when it comes to US-imposed rulings. In fact, when Donald Trump came to office in 2016 and pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA, the US slapped over 700 sanctions on Iran in just one day. There's no doubt, however, that the sanctions placed on Iran are solely political in nature, as confirmed in the reasons Iran is sanctioned by the former US-Iran Special Representative, Brian Hook.
Because if you don't sanction these people, it sends a message. It's a message of silence or looking the other way. And as I said, we stand with the Iranian people. We want to elevate a lot of these people in sort of the consciousness of the international community.
However, with Donald Trump knowingly facing an uphill battle in his bid to secure a second term in the White House, he stated that should he be re-elected, he'll aim to do a new deal with Iran within just 30 days of securing a second term. Yet, this is highly likely to be just a vote-grabbing tool, which matches his optimism for the Iranian economy in the future, which under sanctions is forced to maintain self-sufficiency.
Give this a chance, give it a good chance, because I think Iran potentially has a phenomenal future. And I say that about North Korea too. I've said it about North Korea. I think North Korea has a phenomenal future, and I think Iran also has a phenomenal future.
Much like Syria though, Iran is also finding times hard as its currency sinks to record lows against the major world currencies, with the Iranian rial floating around 23,000 to the dollar on unofficial markets, the euro at around 27,500, and the British pound at 30,000, which is 6 times the amount it was when the JCPOA was in place. The impact on the traders and consumers in Iran have started to show, with inflation reaching higher and higher points as foreign direct investment and currency dries up, with many businesses struggling to maintain prices for more than a day, with some trades dealing in goods in prices by the hour, depending on the price of the dollar. Add on top of the challenges faced when dealing with such economic sanctions the notion of dealing with humanitarian sanctions, then Iran is in an even tougher situation, especially in light of the arrival of the COVID-19 virus, in which Iran has struggled to purchase vital medical equipment, not through a lack of not having money to pay for the goods, but because foreign medical suppliers are in fear of the US consequences should they trade with Iran. It's no wonder then that Iran has labelled the US sanctions on the country as nothing more than economic terrorism.
Joining me in the studio today is Kern Alexander, a professor of banking regulation at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He's the author of multiple research articles and books, including Economic Sanctions, law and public policy, and has led research projects as well as commissioning articles for the United Nations and Cambridge University. He's also been a special advisor to the UK Parliament's Joint Select Committee. Professor, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So first up, there is much debate as to the effectiveness of these economic sanctions, with many arguing that they are a more suitable alternative to conflict. But in your opinion, are they truly as smart as they are supposed to be?
Well, sanctions have historically been used by countries as instruments of foreign policy. And countries, the effectiveness of sanctions depends really on the extent and influence of a country's economy. So the United States, of course, comes in for a lot of criticism for its use of economic sanctions because the U.S. economy is large and many countries want to trade with the U.S. But the downside of that is that when the U.S. wants to try to get its way in foreign policy, it will restrict access to its economy.
Well, taking a look at how current global challenges have actually impacted the world, some of the countries that are suffering the most are those under sanctions. What do you think can be done to assist those countries during these more, let's say, challenging times?
Well, most sanctions programs have exceptions for humanitarian aid. And this goes all the way back to the 1990s when there was the Iraq oil embargo after the Gulf War, the early 1990s. The effect of the embargo against Iraq was that there was a lot of suffering. Civilians went without health care and foodstuffs, and therefore, as a result, the Oil for Food program was launched by the United Nations Security Council with the U.S. as one of the countries implementing that, which created an exemption. It allowed Iraq to sell oil to get food and health care services. So generally, economic sanctions, most sanctions programs have these exemptions built in already for humanitarian social support.
And finally, Professor, it seems that sanctions not only affect the people of a nation under these sanctions, but also those who wish to trade and have commercial ties with those under sanctions, especially when it comes to trading certain goods, such as, let's say, medical supplies. How risky is it then for such companies to trade with the countries who are under these sanctions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Some countries, like the United States, have what they call third country sanction programs, in which they target companies and individuals in friendly states who might be doing business with a state that is a target of U.S. sanctions. And we see this particularly with the Cuban trade embargo program. And so the U.S. has got economic sanctions that target foreign companies based in Europe or other countries who may be doing business in Cuba, where the business is benefiting from the use of confiscated or expropriated property in Cuba. And so now the result of that is businesses are unhappy about that. They feel that they should not be targeted by U.S. sanctions. For example, a Spanish hotel company that wants to invest in a Cuban hotel might run up against the chance of having sanctions imposed on the Spanish company because it's investing in property in Cuba that was expropriated by the Cuban government without paying compensation to the former U.S. owner.
Professor Kern Alexander from the University of Zurich, many thanks for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break now here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming up. We're joined by a regular journalist and researcher, Atifeh Padidar, as she runs through some of her thoughts and findings. Also take a look at the impact of sanctions on the war-torn Yemen. And we will then go to South America, examine how sanctions are affecting Venezuela and Cuba. We also take a few moments to look at what else is happening in the world and see which economic headlines are hitting the front pages. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message. Time now to bring in Atifeh to tell us her take on sanctions. Atifeh, welcome back. We haven't seen you in a while. What do you have for us today?
A lot of people think that when it comes to sanctions, it's only politics or economy. But surprisingly, education is one of the most affected ones. Sanctions always bring economic difficulties. and this can mean not everyone can afford to go to school. You might think that in a country where education is free, how is it possible for a kid not to be able to go to school? Imagine children in remote areas where families need a workforce more than educated children, or schools that need money to get developed. When they don't receive their needed budget, they're forced to shut down. Another factor affected education is massive migration of teachers and school staff. A lot of teachers from public school might leave because of poor salaries or unpaid ones. The migration of children from public school can endanger opportunities that await kids from poor homes and family backgrounds. Now imagine a country like Syria that is struggling with war and sanction at the same time. Do most Syrian kids have a chance to go to school, even a bad one? In countries under sanctions, affected families are left with responsibility of providing school material for their children, even under terrible economic situation. Given this scenario, it is evident that Western sanctions have severe consequences beyond just food and the basics, taking away the future of civilian population, and thus where they come from. Cover?
Thank you so much for that, Atifa. We appreciate it. Atifa there. Glad to have her back on the show. Okay, let's take a look at how sanctions affect Yemen, who's not only dealing with the humanitarian crisis through conflict, it's also trying to deal with the coronavirus, as well as, of course, sanctions.
Another nation with a detailed list of sanctions on them is Yemen, who not only have to deal with the notion of tough economic sanctions by the US, but also have to endure a conflict led by the Saudi regime, which incidentally are supplied arms by the United States. Naturally and very sadly with conflict comes casualties, with the Saudi bombing runs injuring and killing scores of innocent Yemeni civilians, many of whom are children. So in face of a potential humanitarian, medical and nutritional disaster, what challenges do the people of Yemen face when obtaining much needed medical aid, especially in light of facing such demanding sanctions on top of a problem already?
Great difficulties as a result of the war. One is that many of the health facilities were destroyed in Yemen because of the bombing and the fighting, and the many different groups were created as a result of the war. So this puts a lot of strain on the health services, and many of the health staff leave or they cannot work.
There are many people in the world that have condemned the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, as well as condemning the actual conflict. In fact, the United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, called on all nations to lay down their arms in order for countries to obtain much-needed medical equipment to fight the coronavirus. Yet, the conflict still rages on, especially in Yemen.
When I read that announcement, to be honest, I thought it was a joke, because the United Nations has hardly any meaningful function at the time being. It's all the superpowers like America and France and Britain and China who controls the world, So the United Nations is basically, I believe, is do as you are told.
One therefore has to ask, what are people around the world doing to assist places like Yemen during such challenging times?
There are international non-governmental organizations who are working there, but many have left either because of the war or because they could not operate any longer because of the fighting. So they left. What is left is actually small contributions here and there from Yemeni diaspora and other international organizations who might have some kind of operation in Yemen. Otherwise, it is extremely difficult.
Hello and welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Tahway. In this section, we take a look at Info News, where we take a look at headlines from around the world. This development was anticipated, but the figures nevertheless are astounding. COVID-19 could wipe out more than 100 million jobs and over $1 trillion from the global tourism industry. The outbreak may cost the troubled sector $1.2 trillion in losses and may put 120 million tourism jobs at risk. Things are not looking good for cities across the U.S. Based on this entry by Barron's, cities and states are facing a $1 trillion budget mess. It states that there will be more trouble ahead. Our next and final piece covers garment workers and abuse. Location, Jordan, where sexual assault, forced labor, and wage theft are what garment workers there are suffering for U.S. brands. Reports that activist groups are working towards improving labor conditions in textile factories, but abolishing the industry's norms, well, that is an uphill battle. Our final report today takes a look at how U.S. sanctions are hitting South America, in particular focusing on Venezuela and Cuba. Let's check it out.
It seems that US sanctions have a clear pattern in how they're imposed on nation-states around the world. Namely, the notion that anyone who fails to agree with the so-called tune the US play are fair game as a nation in which sanctions can be placed. Much closer to home for the US are the likes of Venezuela and Cuba, once again two more nations that refuse to toe the so-called American version of democracy line, and hence once again victims of excessive pressure by the US to make them collapse from within. Yet, both have proven that such tactics fail. Many in Venezuela are defiant against Trump and his backing of the puppet proxy in the form of Juan Guaido, claiming that Trump needs to stay well away from the internal affairs of the republic. Yet in spite of the pressures of the US sanctions, Venezuela has proven itself to be defiant in the face of them, in particular when it came to dealing with its low fuel supply, when Iran, a trading partner of the country, stepped in and supplied Venezuela with much-needed gasoline, right under the noses of the US, who were powerless to stop the flow. Another nation in the region that has endured decades of US sanctions is Cuba, once again a nation that prides itself on its independent school of thought, away from the US model. Although diplomatic relations have thawed slightly between the US and Cuba, tension still continues to be felt. Yet the streets and resorts of Cuba are still a popular destination for tourists from across the world, as the music, soul, smoke and history of Cuba bring in the visitors, and hence with it, the much-needed foreign currency that allows Cuba to truly thrive as a nation, in spite of the shadow of US sanctions looming just above them.
In a world where war, divisions, illnesses, and economic hardships seem to affect the already poorest nations, the issuing of sanctions is nothing more than rubbing salt into an already deep and open wound. The U.S. may claim the sanctions are a non-violent way of suppressing those who do not align to the U.S. ideology. But the truth is, be it through a warhead, bullet, or particular sanction, the end result is the same. It is the poorest people who suffer the most. However, in times of hardships, the reality of sticking together through thick and thin has demonstrated that sanctions can be broken, as in the case of the Iran-Venezuela petrol shipment, the multinational fight against Daesh and other terrorists in West Asia, as well, of course, the joint effort to assist Lebanon following the fateful explosion and consequent rebuilding of Beirut. As I have mentioned before, and I will say it again, we really love to hear from our viewers about the stories that matter to them. So do make sure you get in touch with us via our Twitter page using @ED_program. And leave us a message. We'll get right back to you if you do. You can watch the show again and all of our past episodes by logging on to our website and clicking on shows, where you will find Economic Divide on demand and ready for you to watch anytime, anywhere. That just about does it, and that's all the time we have for this week's show. I've been Kaveh Tahway. On behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time. Take care and stay safe.